Hey folks, it's Finn. You're about to listen to a really special bonus episode of the Irish History Podcast with a special guest, Blindboy from the Blindboy Podcast. Now it's brought to you by Now, where you can stream Season 2 of House of the Dragon weekly every Monday. All you need is a Now Entertainment membership to stream House of the Dragon without a contract. You've heard me talking about the show before. It's the prequel to Game of Thrones. Now, I loved Season 1 of House of the Dragon. The Kingdom of Westeros teetered on the edge of civil war, and in Season 2, that breaks into the open. Now, I'm a big fan of the show, but if you haven't checked it out yet, I can tell you it'll be right up your street. House of the Dragon has all the things yourself and myself love as fans of history. It's inspired by medieval history and mythology, so for history fans like us, it's gripping stuff. It's got a big budget, the acting is top class, and the production values bring the world of Westeros to life. Now you can stream House of the Dragon Season 2 weekly every Monday with Now without a contract. It's the big TV moment of the summer. Now in this episode, Blindboy and myself had a great conversation. He's big into his mythology, and well, as you know, I'm big into my history. So we started out talking about where history and mythology meet, and if myths were inspired by real-world events in the past. Was there a great flood, like the biblical flood? That kind of thing. Now, after setting off down that road, we ended up in ancient Greece. We talked about how societies in the past were able to pass down stories over hundreds of generations. And then we finished up talking about modern conspiracy theories and the myths that inspire them. So we covered a lot of ground. Just a heads up, the language in this episode is a little stronger than normal. But that said, let's get into it. And Blindboy kicks us off, so you'll hear him first.
How are you, Finn? What's the crack?
Well, how are you doing?
So, you're enjoying the Season 2 of House of the Dragon?
Yeah, I am. Like I was a massive Game of Thrones fan, so I had to wait for this to come back, so I'm loving it. Yeah.
You're a historian. Like you present the Irish History Podcast, which is, I think it's the first podcast I ever listened to was your podcast a long, long time ago, back in 2010.
Yeah.
Because I didn't even, I think literally what happened is that day someone told me what a podcast was. And then I went, typed in Irish history and you came up and then I started listening to you. But you're a historian and you're an academic. And I love Irish history. I love Irish mythology, but I'm not an academic. And the thing is for me is it's good and bad. I have a bit of freedom, Finn, in that I can be incorrect and I can talk out of my arse and there's no one there to pull me up. But with you have to have a bit more rigor as an actual historian. And what I'd love to know really is, how does like mythology sit with you? Because House of the Dragon, it's fantasy. It's fantasy that I would say is inspired by mythology, many different mythology from all around the world. How does mythology sit with you as a historian? Because it's not facts.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe a good way of explaining this is where I started out. So I would have been, I wouldn't say hostile to mythology, but like really skeptical. And I think a lot of historians like are really comfortable maybe talking about the history of a myth and when they can first see it written down.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to get into the nitty gritty about where these myths come from, I've got into that a lot recently. As I said, I was into the Game of Thrones books, and I got into the idea of where a dragon comes from, and I made a show on that a couple of years back, and that really got me thinking though that you have to kind of like if you go back to the origins of myths, you can't have that, I suppose, demand of fact, and you want to know the first person who wrote it down, and you want to know what that person was inspired by, because that's not the way mythology works. But I think the more and more we learn about the world, the more and more we learn that myths, yes, they aren't line by line true, but a lot of them come from experiences, some of them really deep in our history, some of them more recent, but they're not. I think a lot of historians would have dismissed them once upon a time as going, sure, look, you can tell nothing off this. But I think the more we learn about planet Earth, the more we learn about ourselves and our deep history, the more we realize there are maybe it's a way of tapping into a really deep history, way beyond history books, even beyond archaeology. I
Because
think that's what really interests me in mythology.
that's what interests me in mythology as well. Because so what I adore about Irish mythology in particular, and not just Irish mythology, also we'll say Aboriginal Australian mythology, it's the oral culture tradition. So like we know about Irish mythology because like Christian monks decided to write it down in the 8th century. And that's really why we have a lot of Irish mythology written down. But some of these mythological stories could be a lot older than the 8th century. And something I've always wondered about, and something that really tickles my brain is if you look at the Bible, you look at the Epic of fucking Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is possibly 4,500 years old, written down. Loads of cultures have got flood mythology. Loads of cultures
Yeah.
have got an origin story whereby a catastrophic flood came. And what I can't stop wondering is, like, the Ice Age ended 7,000 years ago. And 7,000 years ago, there was humans walking the planet exactly like me and you, with the exact same brains and the exact same capacity for language. And sometimes I wonder, is all this flood mythology literally a memory of the ice caps melting?
Yeah, I was listening to there's a great podcast called Civilization or Fall of Civilization.
Oh, I love
And
that. Yeah.
yeah, but he was making I didn't realize it happened like this, but the Black Sea, for example, was like kind of a low-lying area up until about 7,000 years ago. And then
Hmm.
literally the Eastern Mediterranean, like I suppose the seawall or whatever, the cliffs of the Eastern Mediterranean were broken through by erosion, and literally there was huge amounts of water flowing into what is now the Black Sea. I think it was a bit of a lake as well. But if you think about it, there was people there, like this is only 7,000 years ago. It's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. There was people who watched that happen, and it filled up, comparatively quickly, covering an area the size of Cuba. And that happened not in the space of someone's lifetime, but in terms of like, I don't know, weeks or months, but they're watching places where they lived uh, fill up, and maybe even
Yes.
paths that they used to move, places they used to move between are no longer accessible. It may have once been 100 kilometers or something like that, and now it's like 10,000 kilometers to walk all the way
So
around the Black
climate
Sea.
catastrophe happening in real time for those people.
Yeah. And I suppose it's such a significant event. If your world changes that dramatically, you have to, that is something you need to pass down to your children, grandchildren, because it shapes your whole world. Like, I guess if you're living on the southern side of the Black Sea, you no longer go north anymore when maybe people in your ancestors are buried to the north, all those human
Yeah.
connections that are suddenly cut. And we know today if we try and, shocks like that to our daily lives are they have a big impact on us, and you don't just like move on with your life. And I think certainly something like the mythology that is so dominant and is such a
And it happens in a lot of different cultures at different parts of the world around the same time.
yeah, yeah, and I suppose it doesn't have to be the same flood either.
That's it. But even when the area you're speaking about, the Black Sea there, right? But around, I think it might be 10,000 years ago, or 8 years ago, there was an area known as Doggerland, and Doggerland, it's where the North Sea is now. So just between Denmark and the top part of Scotland, there was an area of marsh, and the island of Britain was connected with Europe, and this was called Doggerland. And they found like artifacts at the bottom of the sea, and they found forests at the bottom of the sea, and people lived here. But what happened was an ice shelf. It was during the end of the ice age. An ice shelf fell off somewhere near Denmark, and the entirety of Doggerland basically flooded within about 5 years. So people there would have witnessed a catastrophic flood very quickly.
The Persian Gulf, I think, flooded around the same time as well. So you've got all these places that, and like these things, as you're saying there, like essentially Britain becomes an island, or you've got two parts of like of the world that are suddenly really far apart. And I think it does go a long way to explain. And but some of the mythology I think that really interests me is the stuff that goes even further back, deeper
Go on.
into our history. So like there's like I have to be careful saying these words because if you run them close together, you can like end up saying something you didn't mean to say. But the cosmic hunt mythology, uh, the
I've heard of the cosmic hunt, all right, yeah. I have heard of that, but go on about the cosmic hunt.
the the but like that's a myth all around the world that involves like hunting an animal and then the animal is killed and then it becomes a constellation in the stars.
Yes.
And, people have looked at this and go, Why again does this happen?" And, dragon mythology is the same again. That goes back into a, a prehistory and deep into our history as a species. But it exists then in more recent times in parts of the world that aren't connected. And like a lot of people, like say, Carl Jung, people like that, talk about
Yes.
how this is really deep. These are deep, deep memories of us as a
The
species.
collective human unconscious. And the theory of that would be is that so we're human beings, we're animals, but we are animals that have a complex system of language. So Jung would argue that we have a collective unconscious, that within the complexity of our capacity to understand language and meaning, that there's something within there that all of us share, like an instinct, like a mythological instinct.
I think as well, doesn't some of it comes from like traumatic experiences as well. Like,
Oh wow, that carves itself into our
yeah,
collective memory.
I was reading this book on dragons that was talking about. I covered this in a show where this guy argues that some of it could go back like millions of years, where like snakes, big cats, things like that are predators.
Before humans, even part of our brains
Yeah,
before we
yeah,
were
like it's like
humans.
in a way, the origins of this myth are older than us.
That's phenomenal.
And again, this is what interests me. You talked at the start there about having to, deal with like, really, double checking everything, that kind of thing. But like with this, obviously, look, no one's ever going to really prove this one way or another.
That's the interesting thing. Actually, does this is something I'd like to ask you. So when you're speaking about history, Finn, right, as an academic, you're either right or you're not right, and you got to get your dates correct, and you got to get everything correct, and you need to speak in a way that you can cite things. But when we're speaking about the mythological, there's so much. Everything is guesswork. Like even like I'm making a documentary at the moment about early Irish Christianity, and we're looking. I'm speaking to the experts, and we're looking at okay, we know a lot of our Irish mythology. We know this because it was written down by Christian monks, Irish Christian monks in the 8th century. But a lot of them are going, how do we know they didn't make that up? How do we really know that the town wasn't just something that a monk wrote in the 8th century? It's hard to really know. Did this exist before the person wrote it down? You're kind of guessing.
I suppose taking it a step back before that, I don't know, I think what really tuned me on to some of this is that, where you see, you got, because like, how do you know that guy wrote it down? But then you see similar stories that are not, they have similar outlines of mythology that exist in other parts of the world, or
Yes.
certainly, it's an analogy from. I was going to say linguistics, but I'm extending my knowledge beyond what it is. But like I don't know, you learn that thing that like that languages all across the Eurasian
Hmm.
continent are kind of they're linked. So like you have
Oh, the Indo-European roots.
yeah, so like you have Re in Irish, Rex in Latin, and then is
Yeah.
it Raj in Sanskrit, and they obviously have the same.
Mancan Magan is big into that. Mancan is obsessed with tracing the Indo-European roots of the Irish language, and he sees so many parallels between mythology from the Middle East and mythology that's here, and he says the language is the key.
That's what makes me wonder how far back this stuff goes. So, like, I suppose, if you think of the language before, I don't know, before people knew Sanskrit, before people would have had a better understanding of Latin, those connections weren't necessarily made because, you lived
Mhm.
in Ireland, you said the word "re," and you probably thought you were unique enough in that. And it's the same, I think, as our understanding and knowledge of obviously of cultures around the world, but also then in terms of our prehistory and deep history, as we get a better understanding of that, and as we've talked already about things like geology, we start to see that stuff though may be traced back to these common experiences really far back. Now, I think it gets a bit tricky when we talk about maybe the more generalized ones, like I suppose the warrior myth, things like that. Like how, could that be a singular experience, or is that just a common experience that humans will, given the types of society and where we emerged from, that it was almost inevitable something like that would come up? Or is it something more specific that we're dealing with there?
Also, with a lot of mythology, it's a way to map the land and to remember things in the absence of writing. There was a fascinating thing happened recent. Well, it was in the 90s, but so Aboriginal Australian people, they had an oral culture, so they didn't have writing. And Aboriginal Australian people have a way of telling mythology. They use things like called song lines. So the way that an Aboriginal Australian or certain Aboriginal Australians will tell a story is that they walk a journey, and they will. It's like the story is held in the land. There'll be a mountain over there. There'll be something, a star in the sky, and if they follow this path, they'll remember this big long story. And there was geologists off the west coast of Australia, and they were looking for ancient watering holes. But they knew that these watering holes were submerged by the sea because they were so old. And the geologists were looking for it with modern technology. But the local indigenous Australian people, they knew about these watering holes off the coast because they were present in their mythology. So that tells us that the stories they're telling are possibly 40,000 years old. Because otherwise, why would they know about
Yeah.
this area off the coast that's now covered in sea? And it was one of those, it was a cosmic hunt. It was a cosmic hunt story. It was a story, a songline story in Aboriginal culture about a hunt that takes place across the sky between different stars.
Like, this is where I find all this stuff, it's almost my instinct pushes against this, because you're like, like when you think about these things, I think from the culture we come from, which is not particularly good at long-term planning and perceiving the
Hmm.
world in, we have very short understandings of life in general, in terms of it's not, we don't say, for example, the way we plan our world. We like, I think a lot of people comment on this today that, in dealing with something like climate change, we're not able to plan even decades ahead.
Hmm.
So I think to an extent we'll naturally push back against this idea of knowledge passed down over what seems incredible spans. And I suppose we've also lived through really phenomenal changes, like over the last, say, 200-300 years. So like, not just in Ireland but all across Europe, things like the Industrial Revolution, but then in Ireland, things like the famine, emigration, all these things, and they break up
Hmm.
knowledge. So I think we find it really, really difficult, or certainly I do. I find it really difficult to relate to this, because you're going, how could someone pass down a story with, with a degree of coherency over that time scale when we,
Over thousands and thousands of years
yeah,
when
like
nothing's written
when we
down.
can't really, if you read like,
Well, the argument with Indigenous Australians is that before the European colonizers came, they had an unbroken culture.
even I think you can see that in the medieval world, there's a much longer sense of time. I think you can see that, and I think what we're living through though is this like period of phenomenal change, and change is happening all the time, and
It's so
change
quick.
expected almost. We think it's normal, but it's not really. That's a
Do you
feature.
mean the accelerated? Like, put it this way: if you got someone from 1920 and plopped them into our world right now with iPhones, they would just go, "What the fuck is this?" But if you got someone from the year 1000 and showed them, or sorry, if you got someone from like the year when Christ was born and then showed them the year 1000, not a huge amount has changed. People are still on horseback.
I think it's the historian Mark Bloch that talked about like even clothing didn't change that much over. You could talk about centuries, where
Yes.
the styles of clothing, whereas you don't even have to go 10, 15 years, and people are dressing considerably different. Like there's historians out there today that'll tell you, if you go back 200 years, they'll pick the clothing style that's because of fashion, but fashion as a concept is new. And I think that makes all this kind of to a degree, undermines knowledge systems like mythology, because history fits well into it, because things are written down, you can date them, you can point to them, you can put them in this uh rapidly moving world. They can be given a very specific point in that. Whereas if you're talking about almost like, I don't know, knowledge as a river that's just kind of flowing along, that like, it's very hard for us or certainly I find it very hard to comprehend this. And then you have these things that kind of jolt you out of it. You know, those examples that we've talked about.
The Indigenous Australian example of they knew about something the geologists were looking for. That makes me go, holy fuck. Maybe they do actually have stories that are 60,000 years old.
But it's even if you talk about like what we're talking about there, like the flood myth, like,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you're talking about a period of time 7,000 years ago when the Black Sea, for example, flooded. And you know, if you look at where the Black Sea is located in terms of like, you know, biblical history, it's obviously in the southern shores of the Black Sea are not that far
Mm-hmm.
from where this
Mm-hmm.
happened, but that's still an extraordinary amount of time to pass. And I think again, you know, skeptics, there was a
To
time where
remember the
skeptics would
flood.
go, all this is like just stories made up, like in the centuries before Jesus Christ or whatever in the Old Testament, or maybe a bit further back. But the idea that these were actually specific events that
For me, in my gut, I just think they're definitely stories about ancient floods because the end of the ice age wasn't that long ago. You're talking 7,000 years ago, and that's not that long ago. And people, of course, people remember floods. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer.
something as catastrophic, I suppose, is the word, obviously has such an impact on people that that has to be passed down. I was thinking about this just before we were recording. I was thinking, what traces of stories then do we have that we just don't understand because we'll never find out the event that inspired it or where that happened? And we've kind of got this like story that's been cut loose.
Well, if you want to go mad, right? If you want to go absolutely insane, there's so much about religion, like Christianity, that it's like, I don't know, did an alien come down called Christ? Do you know what I mean? But like when you ask that question there, how much of our mythology or our religious stories make us go, this is so far gone that we can't understand what this was about. And sometimes I'd be looking, going, maybe a fucking alien came down. Maybe, or here's the one. This is the one that fucks up my head all the time, Finn, right? And I love this. So I adore Greek mythology. And one of my favorite stories from Greek mythology is so Zeus. Zeus was like the king of the gods. He was number one. I'm gonna fuck up this story a bit, like so. I'm gonna, I'll tell it, but not exactly. So Zeus was the number one god on Mount Olympus, and he had a buddy called Prometheus, and Prometheus was kind of half god, and they both lived on Mount Olympus, and Mount Olympus was where the gods lived, and they were having so much crack that their life was kind of boring. So one day, Prometheus turns to Zeus and says, do you want to like, I don't know, make like a little race of people to play with? Do you want to make like, I don't know, kind of like a video game where you've got all these people that are a bit like us, but it's a small world and we can kind of just watch it grow. And then Zeus goes, fuck it, that sounds like a great idea, Prometheus, because I'm kind of bored. Yeah, I'd love a little world of small people. So they go about thinking, how are we going to make this small world of people? And then Zeus has second thoughts. He goes, hold on a second there, Prometheus. If we make this little video game world of people, what happens if they get smarter than us? If they get smarter than us, then they might try and kill us. And then Prometheus is like, no, no, it'll be grand, it'll be grand, it'll be fun. They're tiny. And then Zeus is like, no fucking way. I'm not comfortable with this. Do you know what I'm going to do, Prometheus? Okay, let's build this video game world full of people that we watch over, but I'm going to limit them. I'm going to make them basically Neanderthals. There's going to be a bunch of people, but they're kind of stupid. So Prometheus says, okay, let's do it. So Zeus and Prometheus make our world, right? They make our world, and it's populated by these Neanderthal type people. And then after a while, like time passes very differently on Mount Olympus and here in this video game world that you and I live in. And after a while, Prometheus starts to feel sorry for the little Neanderthals. He starts to feel real sorry for him. And he's like, Jesus, they're freezing cold. They're eating raw meat. They're not having a lot of fun. So Prometheus goes behind Zeus's back and gives those Neanderthals fire. And then as soon as he gives them fire, their civilization starts to expand. And then what happens? Because time is passing very differently. Time is passing quickly in the human world. They start to get mad smart and mad clever, and they start to build towns and they start to build cities. And now Zeus is watching, going, I don't like the fucking look of this, Prometheus. Why did you give him fire? And then what happens is they start to make art and statues. And then Zeus goes, fuck that. These cunts are getting way too smart. They're going to kill us. So what Zeus does is he goes, how do I stop this? So he finds a woman, a human woman, who's living in this video game world. And her name is Pandora. And he gives Pandora a box because he knows that these little people that they've created are very curious. And he gives Pandora a box, a bit like Eve in the Bible, and says, there's a lovely box there, Pandora. Don't fucking open it. Do not open that box. So Pandora's there in the human world, and civilization is advancing rapidly. And she's like, I'm after getting a box from God, from like Zeus. Of course I have to open it. I know I can't, but I have to. So Pandora opens the box, and what gets released is human suffering. When she opens her box, depression, jealousy, anxiety, anger is unleashed from that box. And now human civilization starts to slow down. People start killing each other. People get depression. People get despair. But the thing is, when misery was introduced to humanity, why did everyone not just kill themselves? Because the last item that Zeus left in Pandora's box was hope. And that story there,
Sounds like the start of Twitter.
like, but it's AI. It's everything that we're speaking about right now about whether we should create AI. The fucking exact same conversation was happening in a
Yeah.
piece of mythology. That story about Zeus and Prometheus, that was written down 1700 years ago. That could be a lot older than that. So that's a story there about right now when we're creating artificial intelligence. That's literally what that fucking story is. And sometimes a magical part of my brain makes me wonder, are we literally living in a civilization? And thus, does this story come from a time when the beings that created this computer simulation we live in, is this their conversation? Is this the worry that they had?
It's a similar theme that runs again and again. Like, obviously, AI is our version of it. But, like, if you look at, like, gunpowder, the printing press, like, you go back to China, like, 2,
Mhm.
3, 4,000 years ago, the development of different types of technology, that it's suddenly, you know, in terms of, say, weapons, gives people with limited resources suddenly huge power, and they
Mhm.
upset the power balance. And like that story, because it was funny as you were saying it, I was thinking, going, does this stuff matter anymore? Have we reached a point where mythology and the stories of the past that, for tens of thousands of years were being passed down, maybe being repurposed in different societies to fit new religious ideas, but it's the same thing, being passed down, be wary of X, Y, and Z. Does that stuff matter? But it is the same thing.
If you were to ask me now, Finn, right, what's the mythology and folklore right now that's doing that job, that has people superstitious? It's conspiracy theories. Right now, we live in a world of great fucking uncertainty. We don't really know who the goodies are or who the baddies are anymore. And you have people, like, especially since COVID, you've got people genuinely believing in conspiracy theories. You've got people thinking that COVID was artificially manufactured, and as soon as they turn on 5G, it's going to control our minds. You've got racist conspiracy theories that believe that immigration is a way to replace indigenous white people. You've got loads and loads of people believing like QAnon. QAnon is fucking nuts. QAnon thinks that there's a global cabal of people kidnapping children, and that,
But would you think that's mythology, or is that
well, I mean, I'd call it folklore, but I mean, or pish ogs. There are people who genuinely believe it. I mean, in Ireland, neighbours of yours and mine,
yeah?
there are people who genuinely 100% believe that celebrities eat children so that they can get a chemical called adrenochrome that gives them eternal youth. There are also people who genuinely 100% believe that the world is run by a race of shape-shifting interdimensional lizards. And
But there's this stuff though, like, you know, what
there's
we were
people who
you've been
believe it. There's
talking about
people who believe
earlier
it.
though, like, this isn't gonna last. Like, what
Well, eating babies, right? You can trace that back 1,000 years.
it's just a modern incarnation of all this
Yeah,
stuff.
if you
Yeah,
look at the
yeah,
roots of all these conspiracy theories, they're all very anti-Semitic.
yeah.
So, and anti-Semitism, people think anti-Semitism was just World War II. No fucking way. You can trace anti-Semitism back about 1,500 years all through Europe, and you can go back 1,500 years and you'll have moral panics in early medieval European society where they believed that Jewish people were stealing babies to eat them for eternal youth. So it's a continuation of that.
I was actually doing research on the 14th century, but anyway, the 14th century is another time where everything goes to shit for a while.
Is that because of why was that? Is that a plague? Is that
In the 1320s, before the Black Death, like, life in Europe was just really difficult. There'd been a lot of war, famine, plague, things like that. Like, not the Black Death, but other plagues. But in the 1320s, in reaction to this, there was a mad conspiracy theory that went through France and Spain and a bit into Germany as well, that had kind of coalesced. Like, and just as I was asking you, do you think it's relevant? These ideas just came back to me, where they blamed lepers and Jews for
yeah.
starting diseases by poisoning wells.
I
And
mean, come on. Like, there's people who'll say that COVID was caused by an international cabal of secret Jewish people. And that's an old, old, old myth that just changes shape all the time.
yeah, it's interesting that we've moved on, because I'm just thinking as well. Do you know, at the start we're talking about these kind of general, you could almost say like benign things where people are passing down stories to explain the world around them, be it, a flood.
Yeah, stuff that's helpful, that's useful.
Yeah, and it helps you shape, maybe why life is different compared to what it was like for your forebears or whatever. And then, but you can see there's a dark side to all this.
Now there's a darkness. Like a lot of mythology, like I love mythology about Irish sacred wells. In Irish mythology, there's so many stories about water and wells. Like even something as simple as the River Shannon. So the River Shannon comes from the goddess Shonnock. And the story of Shonnock is there was a little well up somewhere in the north of Ireland. It's where the mouth of the Shannon is now. And this well, in Irish mythology, people believed that wells, mineral wells in particular, were a passage to the other world, the fairy world, the parallel universe. People believed this. So this woman, Shonnock, she was a poet, and she would go to this well in the north of Ireland that had bubbles in it as a way to get inspiration and knowledge as a poet. And one day she was staring into the well and she got kind of cocky and said, I want to go to the source of these bubbles. I want to go to where these bubbles come from. It's not just good enough that I drink from this well. I want to dive to the bottom of the well where the bubbles come up from the bottom. And I want to get there so I can write the best poetry in the world, so I can get all the knowledge of the other world. So she dives into the well, swims to the bottom, goes to where the bubbles come from. And then the other world gets angry. The fairies get angry and they go, fuck that. You're not entitled to this. You're immortal. So the well and the other world gets angry and it shoots water really powerfully, thousands of feet into the air, and it pushes Shonnock up with it. And then her body slams down onto the ground and she dies. She's crushed because she was just fucked up into the air by the well. And then the well keeps flowing and flowing, and it carries Shonnock's body all the way down from the north of Ireland through Ireland until it gets to the Atlantic, and that's the River Shannon. So that's a beautiful myth about a wonderful story that you'll remember, but it tells you about the source of a very important body of water in Ireland. So, like, that's the usefulness of myth there when you don't have and the ability to write it. Like, if you're in Limerick 2,000 years ago and the Shannon is flowing through your city, how the fuck are you supposed to know where that comes from? But if someone remembers the story of Shonnock, then it's like, it comes from up north. Okay, maybe I can get to Donegal if I follow it.
There's also an interesting thing that they record. This is putting the historian's head or hat back on. But those things also record what was important to people at different
Okay.
times. That I think as we move away, obviously we live in such a whatever industrial, post-industrial world.
Water was a lot more important.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
a
Like,
well is a source of serious fresh water that contains minerals. That can mean life or death to someone 2,000 years ago. Like I've got a tap, I can go and buy water and I don't need any myths about water, you know?
yeah, no, it is an interesting insight into that world. As I say, like, that we can find it hard, like, oh, just because so much has changed, like even things like just the way time works, that wasn't like hour clocks, all that kind of stuff.
But even the concept, like I looked into this, and it's a tough one to get your head around. But this concept of linear time, people say that really only came into being with Christianity, with religions that were eschatological, religions that at their core were about the end times, and that there were certain cultures, and maybe Ireland was one of them, where people did not have linear time. They had time that was much more cyclical. They had a cyclical time that was a bit like the seasons and nature. Even some people who speak about the other world in Irish mythology, and some people go, "Is this a heaven?" And I say, "It's not really a heaven. It's somewhere else that's happening at the same time. That's parallel. That linear time wasn't necessarily something that people were thinking about. Because how do you think about linear time when you don't have clocks, when you don't have writing?"
Like, it's even up until about the 13th century, every hour was actually a different length because it was
Fuck off.
yeah, they used to divide day, like, they used to divide a day into an equal number of hours, but obviously that changes then. Sorry, equal number of daylight and
Mm-hmm.
nighttime hours. So you have 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of nighttime, but that only is 12 equal hours once or twice a year. And then the rest, so in summer, you have really long daylight hours because there's still only 12 of them. And in winter, you have really long nighttime hours. But it's what you're saying, people didn't need hours weren't that important if you worked like in agriculture where most people worked up until the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
What was important is daylight and night.
Yes.
What was important was what season it was, what the weather was. All these things were far more important. The rhythms of your life were set by, those things, and meal times, were dictated. People were in tune. Like, there's John Menton Singh is a great story from the Aran Islands where the people there used to measure the time by just watching the shadow cast by a doorpost, and they'd
Oh,
know
that's
then what
lovely.
time dinner was. But then if the sun
Yeah.
didn't come out and then there was no shadow, dinner could be 3 hours early or 3 hours late. It's just when people felt hungry. But I think
Wow.
that all is that thing of just how far we have moved away from this world, and these stories definitely gives
The importance, like we have the luxury of these being interesting
yeah,
stories,
yeah.
where maybe our ancestors didn't have that luxury. These were very deeply important things that held knowledge.
That said, just what you're talking about there, though, the same ones emerge in times of fear and anxiety. You
Well, there's a theory as well that, like, if you look at the rise of Christianity in Ireland in the 5th or 6th century, that Christianity became popular because it was in the context of the collapse of Rome. The collapse of Rome, like Rome was this highly functioning advanced society that existed through a lot of Europe. And then at the 4th century, it just fell apart. And people couldn't, someone in Italy couldn't ring someone up in England and go, "Here, Rome is collapsing." So it just gradually, the infrastructure went away, and you had this period of deep uncertainty, and money disappeared, and writing disappeared, and warlords emerged. And there's a theory that in the context of this, that's why Christianity took a hold in Ireland, because people thought the world was ending. It felt like the world was ending because Rome was collapsing. I mean, Christianity's it's an end times religion. Christianity like it's got lovely messages about compassion, but ultimately Christianity is, the world's gonna end, lads, and you better follow this Christ fella, because when the rapture comes, you're gonna burn in fucking hell, and it's just around the corner. So you gonna follow Christ or not? I mean, that's the Christianity at the core of it. End times, eschatological stuff.
It's going to make a comeback now. Then
Oh, big time, big time. But if you look at a lot of these conspiracy theories, I'm talking about QAnon, the Great Replacement. If you follow the fucking money, of who's funding this stuff and funding the disinformation, a lot of it goes back to real hardcore right wing conservative American Christians, real the type of people who believe the earth is 4,000 years old. That's who's funding that.
That's it's quite bleak.
I mean, a lot of conspiracy theory. You get deep into the conspiracy theories, right? The deeper you get, a lot of it points towards Jesus as salvation. I mean, it's terrible. It's terrifying. The world is run by evil elites. They're eating babies. It's terrible. It's awful. But Christ, He'll lead you to just follow Christ.
The
It's like they're astroturfing at the end times.
There's like, I was thinking about this recently. There's the 700th anniversary of the Kilkenny witchcraft trial. The first
Yes.
witchcraft trial in Ireland took place in 3024.
And I didn't know we had many witches in Ireland. I thought that was more of a Protestant thing.
We had it, like, there was actually a phase of it in the 14th century, but and then it stops. Like, there's not that many in Ireland, but the ones that do happen really early in the context of European witch trials. But the 700th anniversary of that is on, and I'm involved in a couple of things in Kilkenny to mark this. And I was thinking about, all the things, the background, and kind of witches and where this idea comes from. And again, it's kind of, we've touched on some of it already, but like this
Hmm.
idea, these certain ideas come to the fore when people are really fearful about the future, and
Hmm.
they lash out, and you can see, like, so even those, I'm talking about witch trials in Ireland in the 14th century, but you can see it in ones in Scotland in the 1590s, and then in England, or in America rather, or United States, or New England as it was, in the 1690s. They're all happening in when the same things are going on. People are really scared about the future. There's uncertainty, there's warfare, and you're really fearful about what comes next. And a lot of
Yeah.
the people doing this would never have once dreamed of doing these things, maybe 20 years earlier, when they lived much more in more
Wow.
stable times.
Well, I mean, a good example of that right now. What one of the like people lost a lot of people to COVID. Now, I don't mean just people who lost people to the disease of COVID, but I know people who lost friends to conspiracy
Mm.
theories over COVID. People who 5 years ago were just getting on with their lives, and now they have excluded all their friends because they believe in pretty hardcore conspiracy theories that make it difficult to be friends with that person, and that's quite common.
That's a way of
You know,
dealing, though, I suppose, Dan, is it? It's a way of, like, the people face a really traumatic time in their lives, or is that being, like, too simplistic?
I often try to empathize. I try to get into the shoes of someone who's completely like chemtrails. There's people in Ireland who truly believe that when you look up into the sky and you see the path that's been um, led by an airplane, there are people who 100% believe that those are chemicals that are being sprayed by the secret government of the world to engineer the climate to make us think that climate change is happening. So, and if you look at who's funding that, it's fossil fuel companies. But there's a hardcore conspiracy that climate change isn't real, and what we're seeing with rising temperatures is deliberately engineered by a secret government using these chemtrails in the sky to control us. You know what I mean? And all you got to do is walk down the road in your town and you're going to meet someone who believes that. 100%. This is getting more and more common. And I think it's people looking for a feeling of certainty. What's very, very frightening as a human being is uncertainty. It's a very uncomfortable thing to not be certain about the future. And anxiety is when we try to create certainty. And I think that's what it is for these people. The comfort that they get from conspiracy theories is certainty. At least I have something to believe. I'm terrified about climate change. I don't fully understand it. I don't get it. I can't look at the data. What do you mean my house might not be here in 50 years? That's a difficult reality to try and navigate. So if someone can say, actually, climate change isn't real, and those trails that are coming off the plane in the sky, that's actually what's causing climate change. It's a big conspiracy. I think for those people, that alleviates their anger and their fear, and that's why they go toward that direction. And maybe in the 14th century with the witch trials, it was the same shit. I'm terrified.
Oh yeah,
I don't know.
definitely. Yeah.
The Black Death, maybe it's her over there. Is it her? Is it that woman who lives on her own? Can we kill her? Will that do something?
Like, is that what we're dealing with now? Modern 21st century mythology.
I mean, I don't know what I call it mythology. I definitely call it folklore. Like, are you familiar with Dukas? You are? The Dukas
Yeah, yeah,
website.
yeah.
Like, I fucking love
Yeah,
Dukas.
that's right.
But
I've
if
actually started using that more and more in the
it's
podcast, just as
fantastic.
that, like, just what do people in the 30s think of any event in their past? And yeah, it's just really interesting seeing just sometimes it can be totally off the
Or
wall, like
typing
what
in something like UFO, and you've got some fella up in Donegal in 1929, and he's talking about a UFO that he saw near a ferry fort, you know? I love that stuff. But if I think, and this is what I wonder about, like the Dukas collection happened because in the 1950s, the government went to every child in the country and said, go and speak to an old person and record their stories. What if they did that right now? And unbiased, how much of today's Dukas would be people talking about these
Yeah,
conspiracy theories that they saw on
yeah.
Facebook? How much of this would be, do you see those airplanes up there? That's actually it's interdimensional shape-shifting lizards who are actually a Jewish cabal are creating climate change through airplanes, and that's what that is. That's what would be in Dukas now. That those are the pishogs, those are the superstitions. Do you not think so?
Yeah, no, now you said, yeah, it is like, of course, that would be what you'd get back. Um, I'm just what I'm thinking now is that if you went to other times when mass media kind of was new, like, back in the 17th century, I don't
Oh,
know
you're
anything
talking
about
when you
this.
have the printing press, what's
Yeah, when
the
you like, so you
spread?
get all these, like, you start getting free sheets and that kind of stuff, and, people for the first time, in cities and certainly in Europe, people can read enough, so you get these and people are
Well, did you ever hear of this? Something I'm very fascinated with, Finn, is you've never heard of chapbooks, have you? So these are fucking amazing. So during the penal laws in Ireland, so Catholic people they couldn't get an education, they couldn't speak the Irish language. We all know what the penal laws were. You had hedge schools, and in the hedge schools, you've got young Catholic kids receiving a secret education. And the textbooks that these kids had were known as chapbooks. And chapbooks were 17th century pulp novels. They were really, really cheap little pamphlets that were sold secretly, illegally at county fairs. And in these pamphlets were old Irish mythology, story of Fionn McCool, stories about more recent folk heroes and highwaymen, all written in the Irish language. And these chapbooks that were sold and printed cheaply at county fairs were what kids went and learned in the fucking hedge schools. And that's an example there of mythology, folklore. Like Cuchulainn was in there. They were trying to hold on to Irish knowledge while the penal laws was happening, when there was a structure in place to remove that knowledge and language and to colonize the culture. And something I find really interesting is, the white boys.
mm, mm,
So the white boys, who, if people don't know, was a part of the land wars, was it?
yeah, well, yeah, like, I suppose an early forerunner of it, yeah.
They were gangs of young fellas who basically they dressed up in mad costumes and they burned landlords out of it and they were violent. Those white boys, if they were raised in the hedge schools and they had chapbooks as their textbooks. And if you look, there's historians that argue that they were basically radicalized. They would have these stories of highwaymen and superheroes. And then when they got to 1819, that's why they were dressing up in these costumes. The white boys it was like their Marvel superhero.
Do you reckon though, and it's the same with folklore or lore today, do we adapt lore to suit our times or can it drive change and things like that? So are those guys reaching for the
Absolutely.
stories that rather than the story itself being the catalyst as such? Do you know what I mean? That
S-
like,
So this is the difficulty with Irish mythology. The difficulty with Irish mythology is the first written example, like I said, was written down by monks. And the monks, and you can see it in the, not the footnotes, the marginalia. So it's, the monks will say in the book of the Dun Cow, you've got ninth century monks, I believe, recording the story of the time. But if you look at the marginalia, the monk has to write a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is, this story here is believed by the foolish people of the land. These are pagan stories. They're not to be taken seriously. And that's written in the marginalia. So the thing is with Irish mythology, first off, the early Irish church gets involved. So they change the mythology to suit Christianity and to portray it as being a little bit evil. Then, with those chapbooks from the 1700s, they're being written as a way to preserve the culture because the penal laws exist and it's trying to eradicate that culture. So what happens is that the stories that survive are the masculine stories, the stories of Cuchulainn and Fionn McCool and the Fianna, because they're trying to radicalize young men to fight the Brits. And then the same thing happens when you have the Gaelic revival. You have Irish myths effectively being retold as a way to radicalize young men to join the fucking Ra. You know what I mean? And fight the Brits. And I've had Mancon Magan on the podcast speaking about this. His ancestors were some of the people who did that. The O'Rahilly family, you know what I mean? Who were deliberately using their knowledge of the Irish language to retell these stories from our mythology, but putting an angle on it that's very masculine, very warlike, and that is intended to radicalize and anger young men so that they'll fight for revolution. So what gets lost there is the feminine stories, stories of love, stories of passion, and stories that aren't about an Ireland that's consistently under threat of being conquered. You know what I mean?
You can see, yeah, I I think just the way, like, obviously we live in such a stressful time at the moment, just on a personal level, but also then kind of on a global level. It's just quite I think you hear a lot of people comment about that, like, these days, or, you kind of know you're in it when you're not the only one thinking it when you
Hmm.
see it a lot. But anyway, what I'm kind of getting at is that I think the same thing is going to happen again. It'll be interesting over the next,
But
years to see what stories are starting to be brought out again.
but we're like you and I are chatting because of House of the Dragon, right? That's why me and you are having this chat. Do you not view, we'll say, House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones or any other huge fantasy or super, like the past 15 years of popular culture around the world, it's not The Sopranos anymore. It
Yeah.
was Game of Thrones, it was House of the Dragon, it was Lord of the Rings, and then you've got this massive superhero franchises. That's what popular culture is for the past 15 years. Stories that are rooted in fantasy. I mean, what does that tell us about culture right now?
I think it probably tells us something more about, well, I don't know. Maybe it's more about the time we live in, like.
I mean, House of the Dragon, it's a great way to escape because, like, it's early medieval European history with a lot of dragons in it.
That's like, to be honest, like, you throw a sword into something and I'm there because I'm just like, I stop thinking about, like, the problems of of daily life, and I'm just like totally tuned out for, like, whatever, an hour a week. I'm loving it. So for me, that is, but I do think these things probably have to echo something deeper or reflect something for us.
Yeah.
Like, things are popular at certain times for reasons,
Hmm.
and you have to be in, like, and it's obviously not just any individual series, it's trends we go through. But I don't know, maybe it's things could be worse. Is that
We
what you
we
take
better
from it?
we better wrap it up, or else we're going to talk all evening, Finn. What I've got one last question for you, right? Because you were talking about Kilkenny. Um, there's in Kilkenny Castle.
Yeah.
There's a statue carving. I think it's from the 17th century, and it's the image of Keith Duffy from Boyzone.
No way.
And when
I
I
don't
go,
know.
unfortunately,
I'll be up there soon. I must
when I
check that
go
out.
and Google it, unfortunately, the result is it's the Kilkenny people have an article about it, but the article is about me pointing it out. So when I'm trying to find out more about it, but I'm the source. But because I'm in Kilkenny next month doing gigs,
Yeah.
so I want to go and visit this statue. You don't know anything about it. Have you even heard of
No, I
it?
don't. I have to go to Kilkenny Castle
Go to
soon, so
Kilkenny Castle,
I'm gonna ask them.
ask for the
Show me
Keith
Keith Duffy.
Duffy, because I guarantee you they know it. There it is, the fucking image of Keith Duffy. It's terrifying. I want to, because I've had Keith Duffy on the podcast. I want to bring him to the statue. It's terrifying. What's going on?
He's historical doppelganger.
That's it. Time traveling Keith Duffy. Uh, all right, I might catch you for a pint actually when I'm down there.
Yeah, for sure, defo. Now, I really enjoyed making that episode. It was great crack. I hope you've enjoyed this bonus episode brought to you by Now, where you can stream Season 2 of House of the Dragon without a contract each Monday with a Now Entertainment membership. As I said at the start of the show, it's going to be the TV moment of the summer. It's certainly shaping up to be mine, so don't miss out. Until next time, Sloan.